Yeah?
Call them to order.
Shall I call them to order? Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear? Yep. Cool and reasoned judgment. We're here today not to talk so much about policy and institutions. We're here to talk about Kofi Annan, the man. First of all, though, just a tiny bit of housekeeping. On the subject of cool and reasoned judgment, a certain Mr. Trump is in town, and I'm told that you need to plan your trip this evening quite carefully and probably rely on public transport and not walking. Please keep your passes for tomorrow. And then the final point I'd just like to make is there will be time for questions towards the end of this session. I'm sure many of you have many recollections of working with Mr. Annan and many thoughts on the secret of his leadership and much more. With me, I have two people who worked very closely with Kofi Annan. Kathy Calvin, president of the UN Foundation, worked with him closely in the last 20 years, following a kaleidoscopic career in the public and private sector, which I won't go into here. My friend Nada on the left there worked with Kofi Annan. First worked for him in Bosnia, then worked more closely with him in the UN headquarters, and since then has done a number of things and now runs his own strategic consultancy firm, Macro Advisory Partners. So in this company, I'm something of an imposter. I haven't worked for Kofi Annan. I didn't work with Kofi Annan. I haven't written a book with him. But I have followed him quite closely over the years. I'm the editor of the FT Weekend. I actually cut my journalistic teeth in Bosnia, where Nada started his public service career, and where, of course, Kofi Annan played an incredibly important role towards the end of the Bosnian conflict. I then worked actually in Rwanda in '94, where the UN was, of course, embroiled. And I was actually in Washington during the sort of tail end of the Iraq War, when there were these sort of epic titanic battles between the UN and the Bush administration. Of course, they seem rather sort of mystical times now. And then more recently, I spent an absolutely mesmerizing week with him writing a magazine article for the Financial Times in Tanzania. I was traveling with Farmer Kofi, and I spent 4 or 5 days traveling with him, and then went to Geneva to spend more time with him. And wonderfully for me, he sort of stayed in touch then. So I was thinking about it this weekend in the countdown to this session. I was sort of reading, one of the subjects was, what was Mr. Annan like as a mentor? And I thought, well, I didn't work for him, but actually, funnily enough, as I think about running the Weekend FT and covering the world, I do think of him partly as a mentor. He gave me all sorts of amazing advice. Anyway, enough of that. Let's turn to the present immediately. I've just come back from a week in China. Nada, I came back yesterday. My head's spinning with the trade war intensifying and so on. What would Kofi Annan have done now when you've got the two great global powers going head to head?
Thank you for the easy first question, Alec. Let me first recommend to everyone Alec's magazine piece from the FT magazine. Maybe we can find a way to circulate it to everyone who's participated. It's a wonderful, wonderful story, and it captures Kofi in a different role with a different set of interests.
You're ducking the question, Nada.
I know. I was going to duck it for at least another sentence. I was going to go for another sentence. I think what would he do? I think he would find it. I think the first thing to say is that it is really quite difficult to overstate how different this geopolitical moment is from the time when he was Secretary General. And if you think specifically about China's role, China was a much, much less present actor on the global stage, be it either political, geopolitically, when it came to UN issues, peacekeeping, obviously the global markets and the global economy. He was extremely attentive to, and I think listened very carefully to, the Chinese leadership in that time. as they were trying to manage their own rise and how they should play the UN and what kind of force they wanted to be in the UN when it came to peacekeeping and other issues, but very much appreciated something that Chinese leaders still say with less and less patience from those in the West who deal with them, that they in large part still consider themselves a developing country. And he understood that, and I think he would have listened to that. I think he would have been really very concerned about the lack of understanding between the two sides. And I think if you look at the negotiations that are going on now, a lot of what's happening between the two sides is whatever you think of the merits of either the Chinese case or the American case, they are continuously surprised by what the other side does and doesn't do, including as of 10 days ago with the draft that came back to the Chinese. And so one of the ways in which I think he would define this role is that, and the comparable moment when he was Secretary General, was he, I think, very much saw that role. And remember, that was a time very much of American preponderance in the world, American unipolarity, the moment that led up to 9/11, and then, of course, the period after 9/11, which we can talk to in the run-up to the Iraq War. But he saw himself then very much as an interpreter between the United States and the rest of the world. I think he felt himself to be someone who both knew and understood and had spent a lot of time in the United States and understood the American sentiment and mentality, and you'll talk more about that, Kathy. But he also obviously was a man of the world. He was an African, and he was very much an international civil servant. Something I know was remarked on in an earlier panel is very much out of vogue these days. And so I think he would see his role, and this is now trying to answer your question, Alec, trying to be an interpreter between the two. I think he would spend a lot of time in Beijing with the leadership trying to understand how they see this moment. I think he would try to spend a lot of time in Washington, even with this particular outfit, and try to understand where they're coming from, and at least at a minimum, try to explain one side to the other better than they're able to communicate with each other. I think John Bolton would present a challenge now. He presented a challenge back then. I'll tell the story. I guess we're live, but I'll tell it anyway. When John Bolton was appointed ambassador to the UN, Kofi got a call from Jim Baker, who had been a mentor and boss to John Bolton. And Jim Baker basically, and I won't quote it word for word, but basically apologized on behalf of the United States for sending John Bolton. And it was the nature of the friendship and the close relationship he had with Jim Baker that they could have that call. So I wouldn't put it past him that it would be a problem. But I think that role of an interpreter, translator between the two, is how he would define it.
Certainly on John Bolton, in my something like 15 hours of on-the-record conversations with Kofi Annan during this long series of interviews I did with him, John Bolton was the only person whose name I raised that actually led to Kofi sort of visibly, not stiffening, but just, and he had a few ever so slightly tart words for him. But anyway, Kathy, you...
Well, when you want to take off the top 10 floors of the UN,
yeah.
It kind of does it, yeah.
You worked quite closely with Mr. Annan in recent years. He kept going at diplomacy right to the very, very end. He was the ultimate diplomat. Did he ever, though, confide in you a doubt in diplomacy? Did he actually think, you know what, sometimes you just have to do diplomacy because it's important, but actually it's just not going to work? Or was he a true believer?
I don't think he would have confided that in me, but I will say, I think he never stopped being a peacemaker. And whether he thought diplomacy was the solution, or translating, or sometimes wading in and hand-to-hand making it happen, he did it in so many different ways, and with the power of influence rather than the influence of power. I just think he showed us so many different ways to do that job. I can't imagine that he ever felt he was not doing it. I certainly feel, and Nan probably could say this better than anybody, he didn't really retire. He may have rewired, but he didn't retire because he was still peacemaking till the very end, and literally till the very end. And I think he felt that was his calling. It was his mission in life, and he certainly was so good at it. Everybody wanted a piece of it. But I don't know that he doubted the ability. He may have modernized his techniques. I think he always was learning, and and he was the kind of person who could consult and consult and consult enough to always figure out, were there better ways, even looking back at something that leading us into the future. So I mean, I think we have so many lessons to learn from that kind of a leader who believes in collective success and maybe distributed failure, who really makes sure he listens to every side, you know, even in difficult and contentious times as it was in that war period, and certainly then making sure that when consensus was delivered, there was still room for making the delivery fungible if it needed to be.
In one of my conversations with him, he actually said that his headmaster in Ghana had taken him to one side one day and really torn a strip off him and said that he was constantly challenging those in authority. Kofi said this to me with a slight smile on his face. So, Nada, you saw him up close in the UN when there was just one international crisis after another, and he was the global peacemaker. Can you just explain to me how this young man who was constantly challenging those in authority had become this peacemaker? What was behind the sort of eternal quest for peace?
The first thing I would say, and this is to pick up on Kathy's point about sort of whether he would basically give up and say diplomacy isn't going to work. You know, he was at his absolute core an optimist. And it was an optimism that was very often, by lesser people, interpreted as naivete and described as such and criticized as such. And there was nothing naive about the man. What he did say once in a while when pressed on this was, he said, look, if I'm not an optimist, it means that I've given up, and I'm not going to give up. And it was not a lack of appreciation for the scale of the challenges, be they development, be they human rights, be they political, but this sense that you couldn't give up. And I think very importantly, a sense that his own lived experience from his childhood in Ghana, through independence, through the story of West Africa, through the story of the UN, through his own story and progression at the UN, was an experience of someone who had seen and been part of positive change. Peaceful, positive change. And for that reason, he was both optimistic by nature, but also believed he had the evidence to support it. When it comes to his leadership style, I mean, I think, and I would go back to the very early days of his time as Secretary General. I did not know him before he was Secretary General. Iqbal Riza, his chef de cabinet and closest collaborator, really was the person who initially hired me to Bosnia and then to New York. But when I joined in early 1997, I was privileged as one of my early roles to travel a lot with him. And he was still then not the man he became as a global figure, as a global icon. And so, those of you, many in this room, spent many, many years with him, and you saw how his persona didn't change, but the way he was interpreted and seen changed over time as he became more and more of an icon after the Nobel Peace Prize and the like. But in the early days, on those early trips, particularly in Europe, but also elsewhere, what you would see time and again would be he would appear, he was the new Secretary General, he was there to introduce himself to a president or a prime minister, and very often I saw how there was a fair amount of skepticism. Many of them had been used to Boutros Ghali, an imperious former foreign minister of Egypt, who made no pretense at seeming to be the most important person in the room ever. But Kofi came in his understated, low-key manner, known to be a lifelong UN official and someone who would emerge, of course, as the first and only Secretary General who came through the organization. And what I saw, and was certainly one of the most important educations of my life, was how in the space of a meeting, 60 minutes, 90 minutes, you would start the conversation, you'd see the leader at the other end of the table and his or her colleagues, mostly his colleagues, with a certain amount of skepticism, uncertainty, who is this person, can he really change it? And by the end of the meeting, almost invariably, the question was asked, how can I help? And I think what he had really quite uniquely, and essentially for the role of a Secretary General of the United Nations, which of course is a role without natural or inherent powers, is the ability to convince other leaders that his success was in their interest. And that made so many of them hard-bitten, skeptical, cynical about the UN, hugely self-interested, still at the end of the meeting say, how can I help? And that was a form of leadership which I've always thought was absolutely uniquely suited to that role in that organization. It's not perhaps a leadership style or talent you need to run an army or a football team or whatever, but for the role of Secretary General of the UN, convincing others that your agenda, your mission is not just good for the organization, the UN, and for the broader goals, but in their own self-interest as a government or an actor. It was an extraordinary thing to see, and he kept that, I think, ability through the really obviously much more difficult second term. Those of us who were there for the first term really remember it as a magical time. Magical about what was possible in the world, magical certainly in the way that he was listened to. But even through the difficult time, the run-up to the Iraq War, he continued to have that ability. And that other element, I would stress, is an ability to be empathetic. His sense of empathy towards leaders with whom he disagreed very strongly, was willing to say he disagreed with them strongly, but still to seem empathetic, made them, I think, confide in him, want to talk to him. He was a great listener, as we talked about earlier. And that skill, again, I think was really quite essential to his succeed in leadership. I'll tell one story about his empathy. As all of you know, he was not a supporter of the Iraq invasion. Why, I think, is more complicated than is generally thought and assumed, but we can talk about that. But Colin Powell, who of course was used by the administration as the spokesman, the driver of the argument for the invasion, after the invasion had started, after the US was roaming the country trying to find evidence of these weapons of mass destruction, Colin Powell came to visit him, and in that extraordinary way of Powell's, came by himself, no aides, nobody. So he came up the elevator 38th floor and walked down the hallway all by himself. And a couple of us were in the meeting with the Secretary General. And Powell sat down, looked at Kofi, and he said, with a big smile, he said, they finally made an honest man of me. We found the mobile labs, which, as many of you know, actually didn't exist. But for a brief moment, they thought they had found the mobile labs. And Powell literally used the words, they finally made an honest man of me. And the reason I tell that story is because Kofi in that moment showed only the greatest sympathy and empathy for his friend. Not, I'm delighted they found him, not delighted that you found, the justification for the invasion, but as a friend, as a fellow leader who had been trotted out that way, if you have now had your argument substantiated, I am happy for you. And it was a bond that was deep, again, beyond policy, beyond disagreement, and that human bond with other leaders was, I think, a really important part of his success.
And you saw him from the early years where he probably didn't have confidence to the later years where he had confidence, but then it was attacked and shaken. So he went through an arc of...
Well, he was, was Kofi himself confident? He was very confident early on.
Early on.
But it was more how he was perceived, and it was that arc.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So you've spoken of his astonishing empathy. I think it's fair to say that he was also very good at using his charm, his emollients to get people to do what he wanted them to do, and it was very important if you're going to be running the UN. It was almost the sort of Kofi Annan seduction routine, and I saw. I mean, he kind of played a blinder on me. I remember the first evening we were sitting down in this little slightly ramshackle kind of lodging in deep rural Tanzania, and there's about 15 of us gathered around, including many of the people working for AGRA, this very inspiring agricultural foundation that he was then running, and I was there from the Financial Times, and there were all various other local officials, and he suddenly said, "I want you all to tell a joke." Like this, and we're sort of looking like this, because I don't know whether any of you have been asked to tell a joke just like that. It's really quite hard. He, of course, had several jokes which he told, and he laughed incredibly sweetly at all the jokes that we told, which were really rather hopeless. But it was it was an absolutely brilliant way of just getting us into his circle. I just wondered whether you could talk about that a little bit. Did you see him deploy this seduction on others. And what was the secret of it, do you think?
Well, I think it starts with empathy, in that he truly cared about other people and always was interested. I mean, the countless number of people in this room who probably experienced that before you had a serious conversation with him, he asked about your family, your spouse, your child, anything that he might know or thought he knew about your family or your personal life. He cared, and he cared not at a superficial, let's just seduce you way, but he really put that first. So I think that also just sent such a signal about who he was. And it's funny because, you always hear he was the bureaucrat that came up through the UN. I heard somebody call him a civil servant earlier this morning. I was thinking, bureaucrat, he was the least bureaucratic kind of person. And so it's always been funny to me to think that's a compliment for bureaucrats, if that's what the definition is. But I think he truly cared about other people. Second, his sense of humor was wonderful, and I think he used it effectively, but also for his own rejuvenation. Third, he trusted people, and we haven't talked about the fact that his era was one in which we broadened the definition of the term we use now today, stakeholders, but the problem solvers in our work, from member states to include the business community, young people about whom he was deeply passionate and cared a lot, and obviously civil society. So for him, that was also, he just had a natural outreach mechanism. But the flip side I always thought was interesting. If you ask Kofi something about, do you think this would be a good idea, or should we try to do this? And he didn't want to say no directly, and I'm sure this was something everybody experienced. He wasn't going to be direct or confrontational and turn you down, but he might say, I wonder what so-and-so would think about that. Or something that told you, you're going in the wrong direction and you better reconsider. But so he had so many techniques for, I think, guiding people to do the right thing. And then, I saw him with Ted Turner, which was kind of an amazing thing, that these were two giants at the end of the 20th century who were trying to change big institutions and who were thinking big. And Ted came in to tell him he was going to make a big gift, and Kofi heard $1 million at first, and I don't know who was in the room now, or maybe you were, but it was $1 billion, and but the fact that Kofi Annan thought it was so important to demonstrate that the UN's doors were open to genuine partnership, that he was willing to allow a foundation to take the UN name and serve it that way as a signal that this is a new era was pretty remarkable. That he could read that this was a trustworthy person, that there was something between those men that connected, and that he was going to show that there was a new day. He just created the Global Compact. He was sending a signal in lots of different ways. He had so many ways to send messages, but that was really important to watch.
I think it's fair to say that those of you that work with him or part of his family would concede that every now and then that the boundlessly courteous demeanor would slip, move aside, and there'd be a sort of flash of steel. And I witnessed that once. Strange circumstance, you may think. We were on a tiny plane, so one of those two-prop planes. It could only fit 4 people in on this same Tanzanian trip. And we hit a violent electrical storm, and the plane was just going up and down like this. It really was pretty hideous. And so he was next to the pilot, and then I was squashed in the back, and there were 2 other people, and the 3 of us in the back were really quite frightened. And one of the other 2 was demonstrably so. And he turned around and reassured us, said, don't worry, we'll land okay. And anyway, we did land okay. And in fact, we landed in blazing sunshine, and it was completely, the storm had completely lifted. And he turned to the pilot and really tore a strip off him and said, how dare you not tell us? The pilot said, I knew it was going to be all right. I knew we'd land in sunshine. He said, how dare you not tell us? That's incredibly bad behavior. So there was it was the only time I saw him just show a bit of steel. I wonder what experience do you have of this? What did it take? What did it take?
Never saw anything.
What did it take for that monastic mask to slip? How bad did you have to be? Was he ever angry with you?
I couldn't possibly remember. No. Look, there were times certainly that I think he expected a lot of his team. One of the things that was the enormous privilege of being there in those years was that part of that leadership style and that character of leader was that he always wanted to have as good people around him as possible. He once, when reflecting on another leader, and that leader is a rather weaker team, said, I just don't understand it. Why doesn't this person understand that the more his own team shine, the more he shines? And the more you actually achieve a collective endeavor. So I think there was, as I say, a lot of expectation of his team, and occasionally if we either were tardy, which was not a big thing for him, you had to be on time. So whenever I would call him in recent years, he'd say, and I would try to be exactly on time, he'd say, "You're like a Swiss watch," which means for once you're on time, basically is what he meant. But I think
Ted Turner's line is, "You can't always be right, but you can always be on time."
Yeah, there you go.
I knew they were alike.
I think I would say, the context in which I certainly saw him have as much difficulty, not so much with his own team, but with the issue set was the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, and even the early UNSCOM days. And there was one, I thought, interesting moment where he was as sharp as I saw him with someone, and it was a big question. It was to do with a particular very senior official who basically had made a calculus that staying very close to the U.S. was going to be the way he was going to succeed, and in that way, not in a proper way, certainly in Kofi's view, be a proper steward of his mandate and his responsibility, either to the UN or to the Security Council. And he sat him down and he said very bluntly to him, in a way that was unusual for him, he said, "Look, let me just explain how this is going to work for you. You're going to betray your mandate to the full council. You're going to betray your mandate to the organization and to me personally. And when they are done with you, they will drop you. And you will have found yourself without friends anywhere." And it was very rare for him to do that. And it was early in this person's evolution, which is, by the way, exactly how the story ended. But I thought and that was a moment where I thought he was offended in part by the lack of commitment to that principle of the international independent civil service, which was super important for him. Again, it's now, alas, quite a remote concept at the UN, but it was a very important thing for him. And maybe, Alec, I can touch on one other, I think, really important dimension of him as a person. There's this phrase, I think this is what it is, about FDR, that he was a traitor to his class. And it was said as a compliment about FDR. And I think for all that Kofi was a profoundly African, to use a term I don't particularly like, but let me use it as a shorthand, deep in the wool, a UN official and a UN person, deeply someone who saw that military intervention was really absolutely a last resort. He was nonetheless, at absolutely critical times of his time as Secretary General, willing to challenge orthodoxies. He was willing to challenge, in his very early years as Secretary General, what was the established consensus among the senior African leadership of the UN about what Africa needed. He was willing to challenge, and I think there was some mention of this earlier on, the whole progression of the UN and through his person, view about where human rights and intervention came in, and then the broader role about the use of force. I think he was willing in that way to both be of an institution like the UN and also challenge it. And that was a really remarkable thing, and I think an essential part of his credibility, because no one doubted that he stood for the UN and was of the UN, but then to come out and say, actually, we're going to challenge the UN orthodoxy on this if we can achieve the aims. And this is, and if I'll stop here, the deep pragmatism of the man. The UN, which so often, way too often, is about process rather than objective, means rather than ends, Kofi always had the ends in mind. Yes, the means were important, process was important itself, but what was the actual objective? It was development, or it was partnerships, or it was peace, or it was human rights, and he never left that behind.
And I would just add that, after that difficult period with the U.S. and the war, and and I think the beginning of fake news, we sort of saw it happen to Kofi on Oil for Food in ways that we didn't know it was fake news back then, but it was. So come to 2005 and the Enlarger Freedom that we just had a panel on, I mean, that was his attempt to actually pull all of the breakdown among the nation states over this very difficult time and decision back together in a grand bargain or larger vision of what we needed to do as a world to have responsibility to protect, Human Rights Council, and a bunch of other things. So, I mean, he was a builder with a vision when he most saw that the institution was under attack and needed, frankly, a new form of multilateralism. So you just saw it at every stage, even when he was most beaten back, he still was pushing forward.
Managing the relationship with the only superpower at the end of the Cold War sort of defined his time in the UN through the 90s and beyond. Obviously, Bosnia, Somalia, and Rwanda, and then of course Iraq and beyond. I just wondered how frustrated did he become? Did he ever show frustration with the United States, or did he just always just keep it to himself?
I'm looking for Mark Malloch Brown, who I'm sure knows more. But so it was a very frustrating time, and I think there were many opportunities for him to have made a mistake in either direction, and he was getting pulled in a lot of directions. I think the fact that he had really good counselors who were Americans, that were willing to lean in and stand up for him and hang with him and give him guidance. The fact that he was still willing to try to work with the Bush administration, but was willing to stand up to them, but still take the heat for not fighting it as hard as other countries would have wanted. It was a really difficult time. And you know, you look back at that sort of 97, 98 period, you know, the U.S. was $1 billion in arrears. It's one reason Ted stepped up. There was a real disconnect about the value of the UN in the U.S., and we'd sort of fallen from a historic highs of 70% favorability down to the under 50%. So he was dealing with a difficult time, and yet he was on the cover of Time magazine and the Nobel. I mean, there were so many different things, but I honestly never saw myself the frustration. But I have to believe there were times that were just so difficult to find the right way to.
Nada, did the criticism? I mean, there was a time. I remember when I was in Washington when the Washington Times and other publications like that were just going relentlessly for his throat. Did this ever get to him? Did the sniping, the Bush administration in full throttle?
So we now forget that in what seems prehistoric times there was a gentleman called Jesse Helms, who was then considered quite the American ogre, and of course was the one standing behind or preventing the payment of U.S. dues, and Kofi absolutely charmed him. And really one of the more unlikely courtships that you would have seen. But Jesse Helms absolutely went from thinking the UN and frankly, just someone like Helms of his generation, but absolutely Kofi charmed him brilliantly. And
Madeleine Albright.
Pardon me?
Yeah, with the help of Madeleine Albright.
Yeah, but I was in Helms' Senate office with Kofi a number of times, and they struck up the most unlikely. Everyone around the room was sort of sitting there thinking, this is such a strange thing. But again, it was the pragmatism, and it was the openness, and it was not forgetting that Kofi, of course, spent some really important years of his own youth in America. I think the period in the run-up, and particularly after the invasion, we haven't, I don't know if we've talked about it, I wasn't here for the last session, but obviously with the bombing of the UN building in Baghdad, these were the absolute hardest moments of his time and his career. And I think then to have the pressure from the US as well during that time was very, very hard. But he, there were a couple of meetings and occasions where a number of friends came together to talk to him about what their view and their suggestions were how to deal with this. And again, even in those situations, extraordinarily patient, listened really, really carefully to some quite tough messages from friends who wanted, they thought, to have some of the suggestions they were making to be the ones that represented the change. And some of them were good suggestions, some of them were not. but he listened very carefully. And again, I think never lost faith either that the UN had tried to stand up for principle, that he, in trying to keep the Security Council together around the mission of having Iraq observe its commitments, and then afterwards, I think Jeremy pointed to this earlier, really trying to bring the Council together, and doing that still with the belief that, even as the problem in a way had manifested itself in the Council, the solution had to be found in the Council. And never lost faith in that, and never lost faith that the United States could and had to be an essential part of that.
I'm going to resort to a little bit of theatre here. I'm reaching for something that I acquired in Tanzania with Kofi. I'm going to put on my farmer's cap, my Agra baseball cap, which he gave to me. So I spoke to him about managing a giant organization, which of course the UN is bigger than just about anything apart from the NHS and the Indian railway system, I think. That's a sort of FT figure for you that we put in every story.
We believe you.
So I asked him, out of genuine curiosity for kind of the managing job that many of us have to do, what had he concluded? What was the secret to steering a big organization? And he said that he'd thought about it a lot after stepping down as Secretary General, and he thought that you had to be a blend of being a farmer and being an engineer. The farmer is the one that sort of sprays the seeds to inspire people, and the engineer is the person that just kind of like has to sort of change structure and, I guess in the UN parlance, create new departments or close down departments or something. So I wondered if both of you could actually speak to this, whether you think that he got the balance right between being engineer and farmer. Could he have been more of the engineer, less of the farmer, or one or other? I just found it absolutely fascinating way of looking at running an organization. And I must confess, I've kind of deployed this terminology frequently to kind of mutinous colleagues at the FT. Cap off now.
When you're about
Edward will appreciate this, I'm sure. Yeah. Nada, Kathy, farmer, engineer, which was he?
I like to think he was farmer, but and I think if there were some criticisms, it might be that he wasn't engineer enough. Maybe he didn't pay enough attention to detail. But to me, there's one additional piece. So farmer is, I think, he really cared about people and wanted to see them grow. Cared about the institution, was constantly feeding and watering it. I think the engineering has to do with running it. But he also seemed to totally understand the need that he be the lighthouse, or some other word that I'm looking for here, that sets the beam for where things could go, and also envisions what's the world that we want. And I know that's a big UN word right now, but I think he really had that as a prime thing, and it's everything from his early commitment to AIDS or adolescent girls, his vision on the MDGs, in addition to all the other entities that got put into place during his time in office. So I mean, I think more than almost any other SG, he saw that there was a third element besides those two really critical ones. But it's interesting, he picked those. I would say more farmer than engineer, but you were one of the technicians.
I think you're right, but I don't think it was a view that the details don't matter. I mean, he had played important roles in his career where the details were everything, and he managed those details. I think it was basically a philosophy of management, and one of the things I saw over the years, both when he was Secretary General, but also in more recent years, when he would be with other leaders, either in the private sector or government leaders, a lot of the conversation was about how do you manage large organizations, how do you lead? Mm-hmm. And I think very much again, I mentioned this earlier, the importance of the team, the importance of being willing to delegate, the importance of knowing what's your responsibility and what's someone else's responsibility, and then genuinely, I mean, this is talked a lot about, done not very often, genuinely empowering your colleagues with responsibility and letting them succeed on those terms. I think I think he was a farmer at his core, as you're saying, but I think there was also a real thought applied to, how do you actually manage something is unwieldy. And you know, basic things like, don't think you're the only one who has the answers. Make sure you're reaching out. And you know, don't think having, you know, he had such an extraordinary group of people. I mean, Lakhdar Brahimi is here, but the number of senior envoys, diplomats, leaders, Hans Corell is here, who ran the organization for him. That was, you know, very, very deliberate. He chose those people very carefully. And he did that because he wanted them to shine. He wanted them because he also knew that his responsibility was such that he needed to delegate in order to succeed on his own.
I'm just going to read one very short quote, which is the one that stood with me most of all after my conversations with him. And then I'd like to sort of turn to the audience for questions or observations. So I was asking him about his seemingly unlimited reserves of self-control when encountering either rather unappealing world leaders or really provocative interlocutors. And he said this: first of all, you develop self-insight and awareness. You know what gets to you and what doesn't. You learn you can't allow your temper to flare up because you're displeased with something. Sometimes I walk into a situation and know someone is going to provoke me, and I just simply refuse to be provoked. Well, it's pretty good advice. I'd like to turn to the audience. There must be some questions. I see a hand here.
David Hanny. I worked with Kofi when he was at DPKO and also on Cyprus and also on the panel for reform. If I may allow 3 observations. One, I'm glad you talked about his sense of humor. His sense of humor was always there. My own first favorite experience of it was when I left New York in 1995, and he sent me a copy of a book about the Ashanti Wars, which had a rather colorful dust cover on it with the British cavalry cutting down a lot of Kofi's ancestors. And inside he wrote, "A peacekeeping operation which went a bit off the rails." And I also would say about the reference to the fact that he was not a simply inveterate optimist. He was totally realistic about things. I remember in the Cyprus negotiations in March 2003, and we were walking around a freezing garden of the Peace Palace in The Hague, and he and I, and he said, "It's not going to fly, is it?" And I said, "No, they're like a couple of drunks, Denktash and Papadopoulos, propping each other up when they come out of the bar." And so he walked back in and pulled the plug on it, but he didn't stop. And next year he came back again and was only defeated by the referendums that took place, the one in the south. And thirdly, I do strongly agree with those who say he never forgot personal detail. One of my sons worked on the Mozambique peace operation because he happened to speak Portuguese. And whenever I met Kofi afterwards, he always asked how Jonathan was.
Thank you. Whole forest of hands there. Then we'll come to you, Edward. I see 2 hands actually. We have both the questions sitting next to each other. Then we'll come to you later.
This is a what might have been kind of question, but I have to ask the question anyway, you know, because we discussed it's Ronan Tynan again. We discussed the Syrian situation this morning, but one is forced to ask almost how Kofi Annan, where a UN Secretary General, handled the situation in Syria today, because, you know, one is really worried and alarmed with the ocean of blood that is being spilled there, and with hospitals being bombed by the day at the moment, and that being normalized, and we see a hesitancy on the part of the UN humanitarian relief chief even to name those air forces. How might Kofi Annan, if he were Secretary General today, have handled Syria? I know it's an absurdly unfair question, but I have to ask it.
And can we have the question next to you as well, and then we'll take them both.
Yes,
then
thank
we'll come
you.
To the back and
My name is Anne Crossfield. I'm a barrister. Sorry my voice isn't fantastic. I've got hay fever and other things going on. Clearly, this is a gigantic figure who sprinkled stardust. My question is, and it may have been thought of already, but 2 ways of taking his legacy forward into the future. is there scope for a panel of renewal within the UN so that you could have a Vision 2020 cohort, for example, of international diplomats who were looking to become interlocutors, as some of the panelists have mentioned today, between the major intercontinental players, the US, China, these hugely seemingly intractable issues in Africa, I mean, indeed all over the world. And further, as a corollary to that, is there scope for, there may be already, scholarships in his name to take forward his legacy such that people can train to shine with these incredible personal attributes you talked about, this persistence, resilience, and huge empathy. That's clearly very personal, and yet we want to try to take this amazing legacy forward into the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Two small questions. Nada, how would Kofi Annan have dealt with Syria? And Kathy, if you want to turn to how would he have, or how can the UN reform itself now? I think if you can be reasonably brief, because there are lots of questions still to come, I think.
I'll be unreasonably brief when it comes to the Syria question, because it's obviously a really important one. And he, did not lightly take the decision to go back in as an envoy, but he saw the enormity and he saw the tragedy that was already poised to unfold. I think the reality is that, there's a lot of, traditional UN talk about the council this, the council that. The reality in Syria is that the people who are able to wield the power to make a difference on the ground have absolutely divergent views about what is right for the country, and the people who want to change it are not willing to put anything serious behind stopping the war and stopping Assad and stopping the Russians. I always say Obama's Syrian policy was a brilliant success. He was absolutely adamant from the day one never to have US troops there, and no matter the scale of the disaster, changed Obama's view. So I'm not optimistic that would change. What I do think would have been different, and I haven't followed this question of whether the humanitarian official of the UN was willing to call it out. I think there's a really important lesson from the Balkan story, from the Rwanda story, and into the Kosovo crisis of 98, 99, 2000, that while he was scrupulous about the importance of impartiality in a conflict, he was also scrupulous about calling out those who were responsible for atrocities. And he did that. He did that time and again. And I think he would have done that here. He would have still said, look, we have a reality on the ground, but I'm not going to pretend it's not the Russians and the Syrians who are bombing the hospitals, because they are. So I think that would be been his answer.
We could obviously spend a lot longer on that. I'm sorry to keep it brief, but UN reform.
Well, two really good suggestions. And there is a massive UN reform effort going on right now, because if we're going to really protect and renovate multilateralism for the future, it's got to start with one of the biggest institutions. So I think there's some good things happening, but I think in Kofi's fashion, he would do two things. One is happening. A lot of member states are taking much more authority and power now and driving a lot of it. It's not just coming from the Secretariat, so that he started that. But also just not expecting that the UN has to be the end-all, be-all, but actually inviting and asking and challenging all the other sectors to be full-on partners, which I think he would have done. I think we need that. And then just your last part about the scholarships. I mean, I think back to the Ford Foundation, which discovered Kofi in Africa and brought him to McAllister College, and Carnegie, which was another powerful supporter. I think those foundations ought to be challenged as well to keep doing that, because obviously it was a very powerful tool, and how nice to do more of that.
A seed is sowed with Kofi Annan scholarships. I see at the back there, this gentleman with a hand, and then Edward.
Hi, Shao from China. At the very beginning, you mentioned about Kofi Annan's role in helping the understanding between China and the United States. I just want to ask you that, in your view, how do you see the role of China and other emerging economies' role in the United Nations, and especially how, in light of the growing protectionism or the growing trade disputes now we are witnessing, how do you think the world should, if Annan is still here, how is he going to respond to it?
I may be fresh off the plane from China, but I'm going to leave the question to Nada.
Well, I think the short version I would give of that is, because it's probably the most important question right now, I think, facing the world. I think he would try to give everyone a sense of the historical perspective here, that this is, an important inflection point in the relationship of China to the UN and to the rest of the world, and the rest of the world to China. And try to give everyone a sense that this is a transition that's necessary as China becomes such an important power in the world economically and otherwise. And the most important message I think he would wish to convey is that this does not need to be a zero-sum story. That China's rise does not have to be at the expense of anyone else's, that China and the rest of the world can continue to grow the global economy in ways that can advantage, yes, China, but certainly Africa and other emerging markets, as well as the West. And the notion that this has to be, the only way I win is if you lose, was so anathema to his own way of thinking. And I think that would be the most important message he'd try to send.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I'm fascinated by the story about the pilot. Did he raise his voice?
No, not really.
Because all
It was in the tone. The tone of the voice changed,
Sorry.
and the look. It was a stern look.
Because
That was
I
enough.
think it bears out what you said before about this enormous sort of thought that had gone into forming his personality and ensuring that he didn't overreact or misreact. Because all the time I worked with him, I never heard him raise his voice, and it must have taken it. Obviously he wasn't like that as a schoolboy. So, but you could tell if he wasn't pleased. Generally, he got even quieter.
Any thoughts from the front row here? I think that's a very wonderful note to end on. So I'd just like to thank the two panelists here for their recollections.